I thought I knew what grief felt like. After 38 years on the force, after watching my wife lose her fight with cancer in the spring of 2019, after standing at her graveside in the Tennessee rain and telling myself I would find a way to keep going, I believed I had already survived the worst thing life could throw at me. I was wrong. The worst thing wasn't a stranger. It lived inside my own house, and it smiled at me across my own dinner table, and it had been planning its next move long before I ever thought to look. My name is Raymond. I'm 64 years old. I spent nearly 4 decades as a detective with the Clarksville Police Department, and if you had told me in my final year on the job that I would one day be outmaneuvered inside my own home by someone I trusted completely, I would have laughed. Experience has a way of making you arrogant. I see that now. After my wife passed, I stayed in the house we built together on 3 acres outside of town. The property sits on a gentle hill, backs up to a creek, has a wood shop in the back where I used to spend weekends building furniture. My wife picked the land herself. She said the morning light came in from exactly the right direction. She was always right about things like that. I couldn't bring myself to sell it, not even when the silence in the evenings got so thick it felt like a physical weight on my chest. My son Daniel was the only family I had left. He's 39 now, works in commercial real estate in Nashville, about an hour's drive from my place. We were never as close as I would have liked. When you spend a career working nights and weekends, you miss things, birthday dinners, school plays, the slow, ordinary moments that turn out to be the important ones. My wife held everything together while I worked. When she was gone, Daniel and I had to figure out how to talk to each other, and neither of us was very good at it. He married Sandra 6 years ago. She's polished in that particular way that makes certain people look reliable, and certain people look like they're performing reliability. I could never decide which category she fell into. My wife had an opinion about her, but she kept it mostly to herself, which told me more than any words would have. My wife only went quiet about things she thought would hurt me to hear. Their daughter Lily was 4 years old when I first met her, and she sat in the corner of my living room at the wedding reception and watched everyone with eyes that seemed to be cataloging information faster than any child's eyes should. She didn't speak to me that first day. She didn't speak to most people. The doctors had a name for it, selective mutism. She could speak. She wasn't deaf, wasn't cognitively delayed, wasn't impaired in any way that the tests could measure. She simply chose silence in most situations, and that choice had hardened over time into something that looked, to the people around her, like absence, like she wasn't fully there. I understood her from the beginning. I spent 38 years learning how to read people who weren't saying anything out loud. I knew the difference between someone who couldn't communicate and someone who had decided the people around them hadn't earned it yet. By the time Lily was 7, we had our own language, part gesture, part expression, part the kind of shorthand you build with someone when you spend enough quiet hours in the same room without needing to fill the air. She would sit on the stool in my wood shop and watch me work, and sometimes she'd tap the workbench twice when she thought I was about to make a mistake with the grain, and she was always right. She was always paying attention. Sandra never seemed to know what to do with Lily's silence. I watched her, over the years, grow impatient with it, embarrassed by it in front of company, frustrated by it at home. She would sometimes speak about Lily in the third person while Lily was sitting right there, as if the silence meant the ears didn't work either. I bit my tongue more times than I can count. About 18 months ago, things started to shift in ways I didn't immediately understand. Daniel began calling more frequently, which I initially took as a good sign, the kind of adult reconnection I had been hoping for. But the conversations had a texture to them that felt rehearsed. He asked about the property a lot, about whether I had a will in place, about whether I had thought about what would happen to the house if my health declined. I told him I had everything handled and changed the subject, but the calls kept coming back around to the same terrain, and I filed it away the way I used to file things on the job, not as evidence of anything yet, just as something to watch. Sandra began offering to handle things for me. She set up an online account to manage my utilities. She offered to take over my pharmacy pickups, since she passed the Walgreens on her way to yoga. She asked for the passcode to my email account so she could help me filter out the spam that was giving me trouble. I gave her some of it. Not all of it. Old habits. I noticed the mail started arriving opened. Not dramatically, not ripped carefully, the kind of careful that's meant to go unnoticed. I noticed a letter from my property tax assessor that I didn't remember requesting, addressed to someone at a Nashville P.O. box, forwarded to my address as a courtesy copy. I noticed my doctor's office called to confirm an appointment I hadn't made for a cognitive evaluation. When I called back and asked who had scheduled it, the receptionist got flustered and said it had come through their online portal. I sat with all of that for a few weeks. I ran it through the part of my brain that spent 4 decades looking for the shape of things before the shape became obvious. What I kept coming back to was simple. Someone was building a case that I was declining. Medically, mentally. The kind of case you'd need if you wanted to petition a court for guardianship over an elderly man who owned 3 acres with a creek on the back end that a developer would pay serious money for. I want to be clear about something. I am not a man who frightens easily, and I am not a man who jumps to conclusions. I needed proof. Without it, I had a retired detective's instinct, and a family I didn't want to blow apart on a suspicion. So I waited. The opportunity came on a Tuesday in October. Daniel called to say he and Sandra were going to a conference in Atlanta, 4 days, leaving that Friday. Could I watch Lily? She'd been with me before, plenty of times. She liked the wood shop, liked the creek, liked my chili, which I made too spicy for everyone except the 2 of us. I said yes without hesitation. Sandra dropped her off Friday afternoon. She had Lily's overnight bag in one hand and her phone in the other, and she barely looked up from the screen during the handoff. She kissed Lily once on the top of the head and told her to behave, told me she'd left a list of instructions in the bag and was back in her car in under 3 minutes. I watched the taillights disappear around the bend in the driveway. Lily stood beside me on the porch. She watched the car go. Then she turned and looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It wasn't her usual careful stillness. It was something more deliberate. The look of someone who has been waiting for a door to open and has finally heard the latch. She said, "Grandpa, we need to talk." Her voice was clear, steady, not the halting, half-whispered thing she produced for the therapist's recordings. Full voice, her real voice. I had heard it before, in the wood shop, when it was just the 2 of us, but never with that tone, never with that particular weight sitting behind the words. I said, "Okay, sweetheart, I'm listening." She took my hand and led me inside, to the kitchen table. She sat down across from me, the way I used to sit across from witnesses, squared up, ready. She reached into the front pocket of her hoodie and pulled out my old digital voice recorder, the one I kept in the junk drawer by the back door, the one I hadn't used in years. She set it on the table between us. She said, "I've been keeping this since August." I looked at the recorder and then back at her. I kept my face very still, the way you learn to when you need a witness to keep going without interference. She said, "Mom makes phone calls in the car when she thinks I'm asleep." "I'm never asleep." She paused. "She has a man named Gerald. He's a developer. She's been talking to him about your property for a long time. She told him that you were getting confused, that you forgot things. She said she was going to get you evaluated and then get herself and Dad appointed as your legal guardians." She looked at the recorder. I got most of it on there. I sat with that for a moment, not because I was surprised the shape had been there for weeks, but because it was my granddaughter's voice delivering it. Because it was Lily, who everyone in her world had quietly written off as unreachable, as somewhere else, as less than present. And she had been right here the entire time. I asked her why she hadn't told me sooner. She said, "I was waiting until I had enough. I didn't want it to be my word against hers." 38 years on the job, and I had never felt more outclassed by anyone in any room. I pressed play on the recorder. The audio was rough, recorded from a car's back seat. Ambient road noise underneath. But the voices were clear enough. Sandra's voice, which I knew well. A man's voice I didn't know, presumably Gerald. They talked in the easy shorthand of people who have been working together long enough to skip the preliminaries. They talked about a timeline. They talked about the property assessment. They talked about the cognitive evaluation as though it were already a formality. Sandra said the appointment was set for November, and that the doctor was, and here she used a word that turned my stomach, accommodating. Gerald laughed. He mentioned a figure, the number they were expecting from the commercial development group once the land was cleared and rezoned. It was a number that made the whole shape of the thing suddenly very clean and very ugly. Then there was a second recording, shorter. Sandra's voice again, this time talking to my son. Daniel's voice quiet on the other end, asking if they really had to do it this way. Sandra's voice hardening. She said, "Your father is not going to sell voluntarily. You know that. This is the only way." A long silence from Daniel. Then, very quietly, he said he didn't want to talk about it anymore. I stopped the playback. Lily watched my face. She said, "Dad doesn't want to do it, but he won't stop her either." I nodded slowly. I knew that particular kind of moral cowardice. I had seen it hundreds of times in my career. The person who doesn't pull the trigger but holds the door open and looks away. It's its own kind of participation. I asked Lily how long she had been listening to her mother's phone calls. She said since the summer, when she had overheard the first conversation through the wall of her bedroom at home. She said she had understood immediately what was being planned. She said she had been scared, but that she had decided the most useful thing she could do was keep collecting information instead of acting too early. I thought about the 8-year-old I had been at her age, what I had known, what I had understood, what adults had assumed I couldn't comprehend. I thought about how the quietest people in every room I had ever worked in were always the ones who knew the most. I told her she had done exactly the right thing. She leaned back in the chair and let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for several months. That evening, after she was settled with a book, I sat in the wood shop alone and thought it through the way I used to work a case. I had audio evidence, but it was recorded by a 10-year-old without consent, in a state where the admissibility would be complicated. I had circumstantial documentation, the open mail, the unauthorized medical appointment, the forwarded property tax letter. I had my son's tacit involvement. What I didn't have yet was a completed act. They hadn't filed anything. The evaluation hadn't happened. The guardianship petition hadn't been submitted, which meant I had time to get ahead of it. The next morning, I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia, who had handled my wife's estate and who I trusted completely. I did not call from my regular phone. I drove to town and used the landline at the diner where I'd eaten breakfast for 20 years, and where the owner, a man named Tom, would not have noticed or cared. I laid out everything for Patricia. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Raymond, I need you to listen to me carefully, because the next 2 weeks are going to determine how this ends." She told me what to do and what not to do. She told me to stop volunteering information about my finances and health to anyone in Daniel's household. She told me to document everything I could remember about the past 18 months, dates, conversations, actions taken without my consent. She told me she would begin the process of filing a protective declaration regarding the property, a legal instrument that would make any guardianship maneuver significantly more difficult. She told me to act normal. I am a very good actor when I need to be. 38 years undercover on a handful of cases will do that for you. Daniel and Sandra came back on Tuesday. Sandra brought pastries from a bakery in Atlanta and set them on my kitchen counter and asked how Lily had been. I said she'd been wonderful company. Sandra looked at Lily with that particular evaluating look she had, the one searching for evidence of normal behavior, and Lily looked back at her mother with her face arranged into the careful neutrality she had perfected over years of practice. Over the following 2 weeks, I played the role Sandra needed me to play. I called her twice to ask about bills I already knew the answers to, questions engineered to sound like confusion. I mentioned, casually, to Daniel in a phone call, that I had been having trouble remembering some of my passwords. I let Sandra reschedule the cognitive evaluation for the first week of November, which she did with a warmth that, knowing what I knew, required me to draw on every reserve of self-control I possessed. Meanwhile, Patricia was working. The protective property declaration was filed on October 28th. She also contacted a colleague who specialized in elder financial abuse, a woman named Dr. Carla Reeves, who agreed to conduct her own independent cognitive assessment, a proper one, documented, dated, and professionally administered 2 days before Sandra's arranged appointment. Patricia also suggested I reach out to the Clarksville PD's Elder Crimes Unit, which I had helped build during my last 5 years on the force. They were interested in what I had to tell them. On the morning of Sandra's scheduled evaluation, Patricia arrived at my house first. Then, Dr. Reeves, whose independent assessment from 2 days prior showed, in formal clinical language, no evidence of cognitive decline whatsoever. Then, 10 minutes after that, 2 detectives I had trained 15 years ago, who greeted me with handshakes and looked at everything Patricia put in front of them with the careful eyes of people who knew exactly what they were looking at. Sandra arrived at 10:15. She walked in with a folder and a smile and stopped moving when she saw the people sitting at my kitchen table. She said, "Raymond, what is this?" I said, "Please sit down, Sandra." She looked at the detectives. She looked at Patricia. She looked at the folder Patricia had open on the table, which contained, among other things, a printed transcript of the audio recordings from the voice recorder, certified by a forensic audio specialist Patricia had hired at impressive speed. She looked at me. I said, "I'd like to introduce you to my attorney and two of my former colleagues. We have some things to discuss." She sat down. I won't say it was easy. The conversation that followed was not a clean, cinematic confrontation. Sandra cycled through several strategies: denial, reframing, an attempt to paint my suspicion itself as evidence of the paranoia she had been intending to document. Patricia handled it without raising her voice once. The detectives asked questions in the measured, unhurried way that I recognized as the style of people who already know the answers. When Sandra realized the audio recordings existed, when she understood that the voice she could hear on Patricia's laptop was her own, in her own car, discussing a timeline and a developer and an accommodating doctor, she stopped talking entirely and asked for her own attorney. The detectives were not there to arrest her that morning. This was not television. The investigation that followed took 11 weeks. Gerald, the developer, cooperated quickly. Once his own exposure became clear, he had commissioned a property assessment without the owner's knowledge or consent, which created legal problems for him independent of Sandra's scheme. The doctor whose appointment Sandra had arranged was referred to the state medical board. Sandra was eventually charged with conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse, filing false information with a medical provider, and 2 additional counts that I'll leave to the court records to describe. Daniel, I have thought about how to talk about my son more times than I can count, and I still don't have language that feels completely honest and completely fair at the same time. He knew. He did not initiate, and the evidence suggests he resisted at several points along the way. But he knew, and he said nothing, and he let it proceed. He came to my house the week after Sandra's confrontation with Patricia, and he sat in my kitchen, and he put his face in his hands, and he did not speak for a long time. I let the silence do its work. It's one of the few interrogation techniques that works equally well in a kitchen. When he finally looked up, he said he was sorry in a way that I believed. I also told him that being sorry and being forgiven are 2 different processes, and that the second one takes time, and that I was not prepared to rush it. He nodded. He understood. He's still my son. That part doesn't change. But trust, once it has been violated in a particular way, has to be rebuilt from the foundation, and we are doing that slowly, in small increments, which is the only way anything built to last gets built. Lily stayed with me for 3 weeks during the investigation, while the situation at home was being sorted out. She sat on her stool in the wood shop every afternoon and watched me work, and sometimes tapped the workbench twice when she thought I was about to go against the grain, and I was always grateful for it. One evening, while I was sanding a cabinet door, she said, unprompted, "I wasn't scared, Grandpa. Not really. I just needed you to know." I set down the sandpaper. I looked at her. I said, "How long were you not scared?" She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. She said, "Since the first time you showed me how to check if the wood was level. You said the truth always shows up eventually if you know how to look. I figured I just needed to help it show up faster." I did not cry in front of her, because she would have been concerned and I didn't want her to be concerned. But it was a closer thing than I'd like to admit. The property is still mine. The protective declaration is still in place. Patricia has since helped me put together an estate plan that is documented, witnessed, and as legally bulletproof as anything I have ever seen. I had the locks changed, not because I believed anyone would try again, but because it felt like a necessary gesture, the physical act of resetting a boundary that should never have been blurred in the first place. I still use the wood shop every afternoon when the weather allows. Last month I finished a rocking chair, the kind with the curved slats and the wide arms, the kind my wife always said she wanted for the back porch. I put it there, facing the creek, and sometimes I sit in it in the early morning when the light comes in from exactly the right direction. Lily came to stay for a weekend in January. She sat in the chair and rocked for a while and looked out at the creek and didn't say anything for a long time, and I stood in the doorway of the wood shop and watched her and thought about all the things that she had seen and understood and held on to in silence until the moment was right. She is 10 years old. She has never been absent. She has never been somewhere else, or less than present, or beyond reach. She has been the most present person in every room she has ever occupied. She was simply waiting for the people around her to deserve what she was willing to say. There's a lesson in that, I think, that has nothing to do with voice recorders or property law, or the particular ugliness of what my daughter-in-law tried to do. The lesson is simpler and harder than any of that. It is about who we overlook and why we overlook them, and what those people quietly know about us while we are busy underestimating them. I have spent 64 years in the world. 38 of them I spent looking for the truth in places where people were actively trying to hide it. I thought that made me good at seeing clearly. My granddaughter taught me I still had things to learn. I'm grateful she was patient enough to wait until I was ready to hear it. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about someone in your life who sees more than they let on, I hope you'll leave a comment below. And if you know someone who needs a reminder to pay closer attention to the quiet ones, share this with them. The quiet ones are almost always the ones worth listening to.